This recording is going to be a follow-up of a recording that talked about capillary exchange and specifically going to address edema. So as a reminder, if I go here, is we talked about, actually I'm going to use this picture, we talked about pressures that either favored filtration or favored absorption. And so we have to review those in order for us to understand what can happen if there's an imbalance in these different pressures or forces. So the capillary hydrostatic pressure favors filtration. Your plasma colloidal osmotic pressure, which is right here, that one is going to favor absorption. Then you had interstitial fluid colloidal osmotic pressure, this one, which favored filtration. So you see the arrows moving out of the blood vessel. And then this one does depend. Your interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure, if it's given as a positive number, it favors absorption. If it's given this, so this would be positive. If it's given as a negative number, it favors filtration. So, if there's an imbalance in these different forces, there's this thing that is called edema can happen. This edema is where you have accumulation of excess fluid in body fluid compartments. So in this scenario, if we're going to have an increase in fluid in this interstitial space here, so as long as you know which forces favor the movement of fluid out of the vessel into the interstitial space and which oppose it, you can reason out if I alter a particular pressure, whether or not it could lead to edema. So let's go through some scenarios. So the first scenario says, okay, we're somehow going to increase that value, increase your capillary hydrostatic pressure. So remember that favors filtration, if there's an increase in that pressure, that could lead to edema formation if the lymphatic system's not enough to keep up and withdraw that fluid out of that area. So what type of things can lead to that pressure being high? One of them you see here is someone has a venous insufficiency. They have varicose veins, they have defective valves. Blood starts to kind of pool down at the feet. Pressures, venous pressures increase. If venous pressures increase, all the pressures back up. The capillary pressure, because when it goes from capillary to vein, the capillary pressures can increase. And what you'll manifest is, one of the things you'll see is you start getting that fluid accumulating, in this case, someone in their ankles. So venous insufficiency, varicose veins, that can lead to an increase in pressure. And the increase in hydrostatic pressure could lead to edema in the legs here. This person over on the right, besides having edema in the ankles and the legs, they're depicting accumulation of fluid in the peritoneal cavity, and they call it ascites. And that can happen if they have, we call portal hypertension, where it's high pressure up in that liver area. But that could lead to high capillary hydrostatic pressure. If someone has high pressure in the capillaries in the lungs, that could lead to pulmonary edema. The edema in the legs could be a result of someone's got systemic hypertension. The pulmonary edema can be also a result of someone has what we call pulmonary hypertension. So these could lead to edema forming. Now, this is not a pleasant thing. Pulmonary edema, it's the easiest to understand. If you've got pulmonary edema, that's going to make it difficult for gas exchange. So you don't want it. That could lead, and also we can have pleural effusion, where you have excess fluid around the lungs that makes it hard to inflate those lungs. Now, another thing that could cause edema is a decrease in your plasma colloidal osmotic pressure. So remember, that is trying to draw fluid back into the capillaries. And so if that value is less, you're going to have that less of a force trying to pull that fluid back into that vessel, and that could lead to edema. So one example is if you have a decrease in plasma proteins. So the majority of your osmotic pressure in your blood is actually due to plasma proteins. So this child here, you could see if you look at their ankles too, there's edema there, and they have this big old belly. And so they've got ascites here. And this child has what we call kwashiorkor, which is a protein result of protein malnutrition. Is they're not getting enough protein in their diet. I think I spelled quash, I think it's S-H-I. I spelled it slightly wrong, so you can always double check that. It's kwashiorkor. If you can have protein malnutrition, liver failure, the liver's not working well, that can lead to a decrease in that pressure because it's not producing as much plasma proteins. Now the girl over here, here's everything's okay. Here you start noticing all this swelling around her eyes. This girl had what we call nephrotic syndrome. And here she was losing a lot of proteins in her urine, and you shouldn't be losing proteins in your urine. So a result of that, her plasma colloidal osmotic pressure decreased, and you started to see edema forming in this young girl. Now another thing that could affect or cause edema is histamine. So why is histamine causing edema? So I have a snapshot from an episode of The Big Bang Theory where this guy has a peanut allergy. He has a nut allergy. And if you, I'm not going to tell you the whole story there, but he purposely ate a candy bar with nuts, knowing he had that allergy because he's trying to keep Leonard at the hospital because they're trying to do a surprise party for him. That is, he's never had a surprise party before back at their apartment. So he said, I'll take one for the team. He ate the candy bar. He has a major allergy to it. Resulted in a massive release of histamine. What histamine does is it changes one of the things it does is it changes the permeability of blood vessels. It actually affects that filtration coefficient. It increases it. And so what's going to happen? More things are going to leave that blood vessel. More fluid will leave that blood vessel, and you start seeing him swelling up as a result of it. Later in the semester, you're going to be learning a lot about what histamine does. Histamine does a lot of things. It affects your breathing, affects your blood pressure, affects blood flow. So here, this was actually affecting that filtration coefficient, increasing the capillary permeability. So those are some of the things that could lead to edema that can develop. Now, one last thing that also can lead to edema is if you say damage a blood vessel. So I'm just going to draw a blood vessel, and you damage it where we start having things leak, like proteins leak out. That's going to affect that pressure. That pressure is going to increase, and that pressure increases. But what that does, remember, it's going to draw more fluid out of that vessel. Okay, so that's another thing that can lead to edema formation. So we're going to leave it at there. And the next recording, we're going to look at things that can control blood flow.